Welcome to Firstline, I'm Daniel Pizarro. The North West region of New South Wales has been grappling with a crime wave, especially juvenile crime. The situation turned deadly almost 2 weeks ago after Narrabri man Daniel McNamara was killed on the Kamilaroi Highway at Gunnedah. He was riding his motorcycle when he was struck by a ute, allegedly stolen from Moree, and was driven by three 14-year-olds. One Nation candidate for the seat of New England, Brent Larkham, says something needs to be done to prevent more deaths. I spoke to him a short time ago. Well, Mr. Larkham, thank you so much for joining me here on Firstline.
Great to be here, Daniel.
We know the situation regarding crime, not just juvenile crime, but crime in general has become very prevalent in the region, especially over the past 2 weeks, where sadly we've had one fatality in Gunnedah, and that was allegedly occurred when a stolen ute from Moree crashed into a motorcycle which killed Daniel McNamara from Narrabri, and that ute was driven by three 14-year-olds who have reportedly broke into a house in Moree and took this ute several hours earlier. The Premier is up in Moree with the Minister for Youth Justice, Jihad Dib, announcing more money. Yep. But the question is money the actual solution to this from both a state and a federal level?
Look, it's a great question, and it's a terrible problem. It's reached fever point here, particularly in the North West and in the New England, and the reports I'm getting back from the man on the street is, people have had enough. People are tired of being scared in their own homes. They're tired, and this has been going on for a number of years now, and it is gradually getting worse and worse and worse. That's a great question. Is there a solution to this? I believe that there is. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think number one, there's got to be repercussions for actions. The law in New South Wales is between 10 and 14 criminal actions. If they're criminal actions, they can be prosecuted for them. Now, the only thing is that it has to be proved. It has to be proven that there was criminal intent now, and not just being mischievous. Now, I wouldn't consider it mischievous breaking into somebody's house, stealing their keys, stealing their car, and joyriding around. That's not mischievous. Mischievous is wagging school or stealing $10 out of mum's purse. This is criminal action, and unfortunately, these kids are getting away with it time and time again. Police will detain them, they'll take them to the magistrates let them off. It's a frustrating circle. I know the police are tired of it. What the reasons behind the magistrates letting this go is anybody's guess. That's what people really find hard to understand. But there must be consequences to actions.
We know that there has been this proposal that's carried on from what the Queensland government has recently introduced, adult time, adult crime. However, looking at that proposal that has just come into effect, there is a lot of criticism from the legal profession that this actually does not do anything to try and prevent crime. In fact, they've had previous attempts when we've had things like mandatory sentencing and all that, which not only have made crimes actually go up, but also become more violent. Can you understand why that could be an actual issue? And people that might think that that's the easy solution, but it actually could make things even worse.
It's a very complex question, Daniel, and I guess it starts from the roots up. Obviously, parents, a lot of people say parents are to blame. It seems to be, this problem wasn't around 20 years ago, right? It may be to a small amount, but it's reached a ridiculous point now where it's a daily occurrence in this area. And of course it was happening in Queensland, and probably still is in Victoria. It's happening. So it's getting worse. So why is it getting worse? Do they because they know they're getting away with it? They can get away with it. They can go in. They can break. And it's not just car theft. There's intimidation. There's shoplifting, home invasion,
armed robbery. We've had several disturbing cases of people coming in, particularly with machetes. That has been one of the worst incidents, and many of these have been targeting tourists who have been staying in areas like Moree hotels, which have become very popular to be targeted. That is also something that is happening more and more, but it doesn't seem like this situation is showing any sign of abatement. That's one of the big problems.
I can only hope that, I mean, you can go into Moree and great, Chris Minns turns up, throws another couple of $1 million at it. What is that going to change? I hope it changes something, but I can't see it. What do these kids need? They need in the 80s it would have been a YMCA. You know, they sent them out to play basketball and into sports and to other activities that young people like. The new fashion seems to be crime. Now, nobody likes to put children into a jail system, and it creates a circle which is not good really for anybody, but there has to be repercussions. Exactly what they are, I'm not sure. But there has to be we have to sit down, the leaders have to sit down and have some serious discussion about what can happen. Because this circle of do crime, go to court and then return back onto the street the same day, it is going absolutely nowhere except somewhere bad. There's going to be, and I've already heard instances of basically vigilantes returning the favour, if you know what I mean. So they've broken into somebody's house and stolen their wallet or threatened them and have been beaten up because of it.
And that can make the situation even more inflamed.
Then it inflames the situation even more. Then he goes and gets his mates and comes back to the house. Hey, where does it stop?
We could potentially, it could devolve into almost like a gangland war situation.
Is this the Bronx or is it Australia?
It seems that there is also a lot of issues regarding what the state and federal governments can and cannot do. You've recently written to Tony Burke.
Yep.
What would you want him to do?
Well, they set up committees. I know with the anti-Semitism problems that we've been having in Australia, they've set up committees to address this directly, and that's a massive problem. This is also probably a bigger problem. It's not getting as much press as it should, but this has been going for quite a long time now, and is getting to fever pitch. So a committee needs to be set up by the Home Affairs Minister. I called him to set up a committee like he's done for the anti-Semitism problems, set up a committee into this and find some serious solutions.
And in fairness, we've been reporting on the situations with youth crime in Moree, Gunnedah, Tamworth for many, many months, and so we've certainly been able to keep covering that. One aspect that I'm interested in is that the National Children's Commissioner, she recently posted an opinion article about what that in many ways people with particularly targeting youth crime are putting the politics before the person themselves. And with that easy time means that these people's lives, these children's lives or young adults' lives are often cast away and not looking at those genuine issues that could possibly fix where these issues are going, like domestic violence potentially is one of the big things. Unemployment, mental health issues. These things are looked at. But for many people, as we've seen on social media over the past couple of weeks, the easiest thing for someone to say is just throw them in a jail cell, throw the key, and that's it. But in many ways, that will make things worse, especially if they get out. You could have hardened criminals on our streets, and that could make these streets even more dangerous.
Well, certainly, though, that is not the ultimate solution. Jail time is not the ultimate solution. Obviously, for some offenders, there will be no other way to go. But something has to be done very quickly to get these kids off the street. Just to stop this circle of crime, arrest, judge, out, crime, and they're laughing. The kids are laughing, and this is happening 10s, 20s, 50s. More, you've got kids out there with more than 90 offences recorded at 14 years old. And they're completely getting away with it.
And they're getting younger too. Many of these offenders are like 10, 11, and they're being charged with some very serious offences, and you're wondering how on earth did they get involved in something like this? That is one of the biggest questions. Something I also wanted to ask you is that the State Member for Northern Tablelands, Brendan Moylan, of course, is backing the changes to the bail laws and sentencing laws. He's also said that one thing that should be done is to target children younger and younger and younger. Now, to try and break the cycle. Now, I understand that concept. The issue, however, is how young is too young? Because you're going to have, if you're trying to teach kids maybe 6, 7, they might not necessarily have that mental capacity to really understand. They might have some basic instances of right or wrong, but if they see something at home that we would certainly be appalled by, or something that they've heard from family, relatives, or whatever, they might not have that cognizant ability to really understand what they could be getting into would be right or wrong. Even though we're getting 10s, 11, 12-year-olds getting into trouble, when do you think is do you have an idea about when the best age to try and at least approach them, saying, okay, this is a situation where they could understand it?
Well, education is the answer there. Obviously, Daniel, if they're told that it's wrong, well, then it's wrong. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but under 10 years, there is nothing really police or magistrates can do at all. That's the cut-off point. There's no criminal action that can be taken or recorded, and shouldn't be. You're right. They are kids, but why don't they know this is wrong? They haven't been told this is wrong. They haven't been educated that this is wrong, and that's one place to start. I'm no psychologist, but the answer would seem pretty obvious to me. These things, unfortunately, and you're right, politicians can go out and throw some money at things, and that will last as long as the press cycle. And they've been seen to do something by hurling some money at it. But what's actually changing? We need some real change there. We need education. We've got to break that cycle. We've got to take away the feeling of entitlement. As far as they think that they can get away with it. If they think that you can walk into a shop, or you can walk into somebody's home and attack them or steal from them, if they think that if they know they can get away with it, well, it just becomes a game, doesn't it? There's no repercussions. There has to be repercussions. There has to be education.
And without resorting too much to stereotypes, many of these people responsible for these crimes, regardless of age, are from an Indigenous background. Mm-hmm. And this is a situation that is often has to be approached very carefully, because you either throw yourselves into stereotypes or you cover someone in cotton wool saying it's not their fault and you're talking about trauma. I know a lot of Indigenous organisations have been discussing about intergenerational trauma, all those aspects, but at the same time, I do get the feeling that some of these particularly younger kids are trying to use that as the excuse or the justification to get away, when they could say, well, I've been traumatized, so I am, so that's why I'm acting out, and that's why they might be also seeing some leniency. And we've seen to a certain degree that happen within the judicial system itself, where some magistrates have granted that at the same time, and unfortunately that has led to horrible consequences down the road.
Yeah, it's obviously the kids are wrong. If they're maybe they've been traumatized somehow, but are they more traumatized than the guy who now can't sleep at night because he's worried about somebody breaking into his house with a machete? I mean, he's been traumatized as well. I mean, we all, for some reason or another, we've been traumatized by something in our lives. Can you use that as an excuse? Oh, I don't think so. I mean, you can certainly put your case out there, but I don't think there's really any excuse for breaking into someone's home with a machete. It's
not something generally most people do not want to deal with them in any occasion, in any situation.
Absolutely not, and this, once again, this is not the Bronx. This is Australia, This is a place where you leave your back door open with the screen door closed to keep the mozzies out, but keep the breeze going. You can't do that now. This is ridiculous, and it's not solely an Indigenous case. It wouldn't matter if they were yellow, brown, blue, pink, or orange. These are children who are doing the wrong thing systematically and getting away with it. That can't go on. This is not right. If they were adults and doing the same thing, and they say, oh, but I was traumatized as a kid, so I can go into someone's house with a machete, is that going to stand? No, it's not. It's not. So why should it stand for a kid? They know what they're doing. Of course they know what they're doing, and they're giggling at us while they're doing it. And it's there has to be repercussions for their actions, and there has to be better education moving along. And it's not just a case of throwing a couple of $1 million at something and walking away and going, there you go. These things did not happen in the 80s and the 90s. And to the best of my recollection, in the 2000s, very much either. This is something that's come forward particularly in the last couple of years. Whether it's a sense of entitlement or whether our social lives have come to the point now where you can't say something for what it is, without fear of offending somebody. If it's an Indigenous child, if it's a Chinese child, if it's a white Australian, look, we're all Australians. We're all under the same flag. We are all under the same rules. It should not matter. So if there's a problem, let's just get in and bloody fix it.
And speaking of fixing it, how's your campaign been going? Because you are, of course, the One Nation candidate. You have, you of course, could be very important, especially when it comes to preferences and all that when the federal election is coming through. How has it been as a One Nation candidate? Because in recent years, of course, the party has imploded and reconstituted, imploded again, reconstituted. People come back and forth, but there's also severe criticism of Pauline Hanson's style of leadership and her rhetoric, her political stunts and all that. How have you found being the candidate?
Look, I get a lot of support. There's a lot of support out there for One Nation, for the simple fact that Pauline Hanson, love her or loathe her, she tells it like it is. She says what a lot of people are actually thinking, with a lot of the times without thinking about the repercussions. Obviously, you've got the major parties. They love her coming out and saying what she's thinking and then bagging her out because in the press ripping her apart. However, she is saying a lot of common sense things, and in the last, particularly after the last elections in the United States, I think society and people are seeing through a lot of the media hype and a lot of the bagging, if you like, of people who are just going out and saying, it's like this, mate. This is the actual truth. I'm not trying to offend you. It's not an offensive thing. The simple fact of the matter is, black is black, white is white, orange is orange, and blue is blue. Now, if that offends you because you happen to be somewhere between orange and blue, well, I'm sorry, but she says pretty much what's on her mind and what's on a lot of people's mind. And that is getting a lot of support, generates a lot of support. In the New England, obviously being a Nationals heartland, which is great. I love Barnaby, Kevin. These guys are like myself are patriots. They do actually care, and which is great. So if I can help get some of these good causes across the line, and if I can help maybe tweak some of their causes that aren't so great, I'll mention them in the future. We'll go into that into the future. But I'm very proud to be part of the One Nation crew, and hopefully we can help to make Australia great again.
I would certainly say that with that kind of a connotations, it would certainly be at least a different form of Make Australia Great Again, considering all the controversies that have come out of the United States since Donald Trump has been elected as president. And there is this accusation that Peter Dutton is trying to cash in on this more right-wing populist style of politics, more aiming to divide or go after more vulnerable people, or even there's even people within the Jewish community who believe that he's trying to use them as a political football. There's this frustration going on with that particular style of very personalised, very, in many ways, authoritarian style of leadership, if you get my drift.
I can understand that. Obviously, there's Donald Trump's a hard guy to like, but there's a lot of people that like him because he actually he does make change. And I believe personally, and a lot of people I speak to, that he's actually doing it because he's a patriot. He does want to make the world a better place. He wants a lot of this woke stuff that's been happening, that's probably been causing a good deal of the world's problems lately.
Such as?
Your gender assumptions, men in women's sport, things like the Jewish people being offended by Peter Dutton because he's either used as a political football. I don't see how that's really relevant when it's just a news story. That's one news story. It's not something that I think the people are reading too much into it. The press is obviously delving way too deep into this kind of stuff and looking for somebody who's had their feelings hurt, and more concentrating on them than what is the actual issue. So if Peter Dutton's hurt, says that the Jewish people say that they're hurting, Peter Dutton might be hurting their feelings. Well, that's neither here nor there. That hasn't solved the anti-Semitism problem that's going on forward in Australia at the moment. And I'm sure I would imagine Mr. Dutton is trying to do the right thing. The anti-Semitism, that cannot continue in Australia either. This is Australia. It's not the Middle East. It's not the Bronx. This is Australia. We are the best country in the world if we want to be. Unfortunately, there's a lot of toing and froing in this in 2025, and we're going to have to work on it to make this place great.
Brent Larkham, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
That was One Nation candidate for the seat of New England, Brent Larkham there. Staying in the New England, and the Australian Labor Party has been naming candidates up and down the country as the federal election draws ever closer. In this region, they've named Laura Hughes as the candidate to take on Barnaby Joyce. Mrs. Hughes took on Mr. Joyce in the 2022 federal election and secured over 5% of a swing towards her on the primary vote. Mr. Joyce, of course, is no easy target. He was the former leader of the Nationals, as well as Deputy Prime Minister. But Mrs. Hughes insists that she is the better candidate and the better representative for the New England. I spoke to her in the studio earlier this week. Well, Laura Hughes, welcome to Firstline. How are you feeling about announcing your campaign?
Look, it's really exciting. I've really waited 3 years to announce it because I was fortunate enough to be the Labor candidate 3 years ago, and we did really well. We improved the Labor primary vote, and a lot of people in Labor encouraged me to go again. And I think with that experience under my belt, I've got a good chance of having a good campaign.
Now, the New England electorate, of course, has changed quite a bit for this election. One of the aspects, of course, is that you will be appealing to voters in the Upper Hunter as well as the New England North West. And there's quite a few different issues around that, particularly around nuclear power with the Liddell Power Station. But we've also got the main fact that this is deep Nationals territory. Do you actually think that you might have a chance of actually taking the seat from someone as high profile as Barnaby Joyce?
I think I've got a good shot, and I think you've just identified possibly why. I think we now have, we do have Muswellbrook now in the electorate, and we know that there's a lot of people in Muswellbrook. Dan Repicoli won that seat last federal election, and he's going to support me and sort of hand over Muswellbrook to me in the next little while. And so I think there'll be some people there who aren't, those rusted on national voters that people think of. I'm getting down to Muswellbrook and speaking to them, and then obviously over the whole electorate. And I think people are beginning to realise that they do have choices. They don't just have to walk into the polling booth and go, oh, and choose just somebody, not really think too much about it. So I'm hoping that they'll think about it.
One of the big things, of course, however, that is still really dogging the Albanese government is the cost of living. Given the fact that that has been a major issue, particularly for areas like Tamworth, which is seeing grocery prices increase, housing prices increase, this is a major issue, and there is that deflection towards the federal government being at least partly responsible for this. would you actually prioritise trying to bring that cost of living down? Because many people need those pressures to be released sooner rather than later.
That's a really good question, Daniel, and thanks for asking. That is absolutely true. We go through cycles like this where costs can get higher and wages aren't necessarily keeping up with those costs. We had the great news last week that our inflation rate is now down to 2.4%, which is fantastic. And I think there's a hope that next week the Reserve Bank will also consider cutting interest rates. They haven't done that for a really long time. And I think that they have a goal of between 2 and 3% for inflation, so 2.4 is right there. And I know that we've worked very, very hard to get that down to 2.4%. So that's great news. And at the same time, as you know, Labor is the party that supports workers. And in many workplaces, workers have received a pay rise over the last 3 years, and some of them have received substantial pay rises. For example, Labor made a focus of early childhood care workers and aged care workers, because they're the people doing the really hard work for our young people and our old people, and they've both received substantial pay rises in the last little while. So we're really trying very, very hard to do what we need to do for the people of Australia and people of New England.
An interest rate cut would certainly be a major boost for the Prime Minister. When the Reserve Bank meets and either decides to cut rates or leave them on hold, do you think that could have an impact on whether or not he will call an election? Because there's speculation it could be mid-April, or he might hold it off till May.
That's a really good question, and that question's in my mind as well. And I think an interest rate cut's good for all Australians, even superannuants, because they might be not necessarily wanting a rate cut, but they've had the benefit of inflation decreasing. So I think it's going to be great for all of us, for everybody. And yes, possibly that will be part of the decision-making process as to when the election is held. The latest we can go is the 17th of May. It's now the beginning of February. I think we're going to get an announcement in the next month or two. Your guess is as good as mine.
One of the big things, of course, is that you are going up against Barnaby Joyce, former Deputy Prime Minister, former Leader of the Nationals, current Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. He is certainly someone that we know very well, despite what he may say or do, and he's had a very controversial year last year. But many people say, well, that's just our Barnaby. How, as the Labor candidate, can you overcome not just someone who's very well known personally, but it looks like that many voters just prefer his style of politics because he's very upfront and we know many ways what he's thinking?
Look, that's a good question, and I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that, if I may. I just think people vote for Barnaby because they don't think too much about it, and perhaps you could argue that they haven't. This will be his fourth or fifth election in New England. Perhaps haven't been aware of their options. So I believe that I am a good option. I'm a good alternative option. I'm a better choice. I asked people last time, and this time already I'm going around and asking people, can you tell me what Mr. Joyce has done for you? Can you tell me what Mr. Joyce has done for the electorate? What has he achieved? And I just get a blank stare. I've not had one person say, oh, this and this and this. Not one. Literally, not one person has been able to say clearly what they think Mr. Joyce has done for the electorate. So, and remember last time the big issue was Dungowan Dam. Well, he was the Deputy Prime Minister and he couldn't get that through. So I don't know that we can rely on him to get things done for us.
He's also been very prominent in every interview you would hear about so-called swindle factories and intermittent power. Climate change, we know, is one of the most pressing issues that we are having, and this could have a massive impact on the agricultural sector. Then that will have various knock-on effects at the moment. What is your take on, at the moment, renewable power? Because there does seem to be this aspect that renewables are a good mix, but we need something else to be thrown into it. The main thing from the coalition, of course, with the abrupt phrase is nuclear, but is Labor looking at eventually going to just relying solely on renewables over the next period of decades?
That's a really good question. You're absolutely right. Climate change is a real issue. We're filming this in the first week of February. There's rain falling in North Queensland, and Australians are really struggling with that because there's, metres of rain falling every day.
And one person has tragically died already.
I know, and we can't ignore it. It is pointless. It is actually wrong to ignore that is happening. We must take our responsibility seriously about that. And I'm really glad you asked about energy because in only 3 years, Labor has really invested heavily in energy, building up our infrastructure so that we can carry this renewable energy, big battery packs, and then the grids so that the energy that's being produced by various forms of renewable energy, such as solar, such as hydro, such as wind, can be put into the system and taken to where it needs to go. And they're doing that all across Australia. And as you can imagine, Australia's such a large place, that's frightfully expensive. So they've bitten the bullet and put in money for that, and that will continue with the next Albanese Labor government. So. And I know people are doing their homework. Nuclear, for example, there is a couple of nuclear plants being built in England, in the UK, and they are years overdue, years, and billions of dollars over budget. I can't give you exact numbers, but billions of dollars and years delayed. So they were meant to have been built in the next couple of years. It's looking like it's going to be another 15 years or something like that. It's just crazy. So I am very sceptical of the possibility of nuclear. I think Australia is such a unique country with our sun, with our hydro and with our wind. It's a no-brainer.
But many of these projects, however, especially in areas like the New England, some have been more popular, like the smaller scale Manila Solar, which however is very small.
Yes.
To contribute.
Aren't they doing a great job? It's community oriented.
Yes, while it might have that kind of popular support, it's not going to provide as much support as in the electricity network as a larger scale project. And many of these larger scale projects out for places like Nundle and even within the New England Renewable Zone are not popular because of the way that these companies have been talking about, have been approaching farmers and talking about what these actually would mean. And there is this major issue about later on, like the lifespan of wind turbines, for example, and how much solar panels are needed for many of these projects.
Yeah. Look, good questions again. Any system needs to be considered. Seriously, it needs to be looked at as it goes along. We might need to make adjustments in our plans. So it's not the panacea. It's not the thing that's going to fix everything straight away. And it also takes time. And you're right about the community involvement. If the community is on board and it's explained to them and they're given factual information, not, calling wind turbines silly thing, giving them silly names, that's not helpful. That's not information. I think most people are prepared to do a bit of homework and find out about those things. There is evidence to suggest, for example, if farmers allow some solar panels on their fields, on their pasture, they have less loss of water because the sun's shining on the panels, not on the ground, and their animals have some shade, and it works quite well for them, and they've got a reliable source of income in those years where the other income isn't as good. So there's lots and lots of pluses, but you're absolutely right, you need to get the communities on board.
One aspect too is that there's also a bit of confusion, I think, among voters that still resonates to this day about the responsibilities of the various state, local and federal governments. As a main clear point, what would you be wanting to bring for a federal government under Labor with you as the member for New England directly to the people as something that's tangible? I know you've often spoken about the Medicare hubs that have popped out.
Look, that's been a great success, and that's been helpful. You know, several thousand patients have been seen at the Tamworth Urgent Care Clinic since it opened a bit over 12 months ago, and that's really relieved the ED department in Tamworth and provided a spot for families when it's difficult to get into a GP. I'd like to see more of those in our electorate. There's various other towns I think that would be feasible.
And we need some of the major ones, because we are currently in Tamworth, we've got GPs who can't take patients until March. And even if you go to the Medicare clinic, you can be still there for hours upon hours waiting.
That's right, which is clear evidence that it was needed and clear evidence that we need to do more. And this is across all of Australia. It's not just for us. But the decision was made based on the number of people who went to the emergency department. So we didn't get the urgent care clinic because Mr. Joyce is our member. We got the urgent care clinic because Tamworth had one of the busiest ED departments for the number of residents who lived in the area. So that's why we got it.
One of the big issues, though, is that while people have been going to the Tamworth one, the Armidale one had to be shut after a number of weeks because they couldn't get the staff to be in there. And that's been a massive issue, especially given Armidale is a significant area of the New England North West. And one of the big problems that we are still having from a federal and state government position is the fact that we cannot get nurses, doctors, and particularly specialists to come up to this region. I remember that there have been various proposals that if we have international doctors and students who come to Australia to study medicine or practice medicine, they must stay in a regional area for a certain number of years. What would you think that could be at least some type of temporary solution, or at least try and get ways to get more people to be encouraged in taking up something like a GP or even a nursing position?
Those sorts of programs already exist, and some of them have existed for a very long time. There's a number of things that the federal government does, and I have to say, it's Labor that started them over the decades, encouraging, even at the level of medical student. So they might offer some support when a young person is studying medicine, and then that young person agrees to, for example, do their first 3 years in a regional centre, for example. And there's various other programs that exist that provide incentives. Even once someone establishes as a practice, there's support to establish a practice or go into a practice, financial support, and there's a whole range of programs. A lot of people don't know that they exist, but the federal government does a number of things to support doctors and other health professionals coming into the area. And you're absolutely right, there is a shortage. There's a shortage in pretty much every workforce, and a shortage in every workforce in every part of Australia. I don't think there's anywhere that's got a glut of, tradies or various other employment groups. Certainly not in regional Australia. So yes, we will be doing more for that, for sure.
Not to mention that Tamworth itself is facing this skills shortage, but at the same time, people are moving into the city. But that's, even though that might be filling certain positions, it's not targeting the positions that are really crucial, especially in areas that might be considered more problematic to fill, which can be certain areas in the industrial sector or the agricultural sector. At the same time, we also have the fact that this is also driving up housing and rental prices. Right now, in Tamworth, for example, its housing price for a median rental property is up 4.3% in the past year. An average property is about $539,000, but that varies depending on where you are in Tamworth. A lot of these things is the fact that we need homes for people, but often they're priced out of the market.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the housing it's become a clear issue. It's been happening gradually. It's not just suddenly happened. And the thing with something like housing, and it applies in any area that you look at, you need to look at the supply and you need to look at the demand. So you can do things like first home owners incentives and schemes and things like that, things to encourage people, making stamp duty less for certain buyers of homes, that sort of thing. But then the supply. So you need to build places and get them happening. I just saw on Albo's social media feed, he had a photo with a whole lot of apprentices, and they were involved in building, I think it was in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, I think that's where they were, and they were involved in, they were learning their trade, but building housing for Australians. So we're looking at both inputs, both the supply and the demand, rather than ignoring it or just going, well, tough luck if you can't afford a house or you can't find somewhere to rent. That's not our problem. They're actually doing something about it.
And it looks like a lot of issues are that Labor seems to be, in some aspects, struggling to connect with voters. We've seen polls that have Peter Dutton as the preferred Prime Minister and the Coalition ahead on the two-party preferred, and this could all come down to preferences. There's that strong possibility we could have a hung parliament, which could mean that the Teals, Greens or whoever independents could be holding that balance of power. Given what the situation is, like, why is Labor still struggling? Because it's very rare that we have a one-term federal government, but there is that possibility that this could happen. And a lot of it seems that people have been moving away from Labor.
People have been moving away from the major parties for a couple of decades, no two ways about it. And it is possible that in the future, Australia will be more likely to have a government made up of people of various parties and various persuasions. New Zealand has a similar sort of, has an arrangement like that. Labor might get the majority, the equivalent of the National Party might get the majority, but they don't usually get enough to form government by themselves.
Because it makes member proportional for them.
Correct. I think that's a reality that we're going to look at. And I mean, I'll give you some evidence. The Gillard government was the most productive parliament since Federation. The Gillard government that had to compromise, they were a minority government, and they had to compromise and talk to various people. And we all know that New England was held by Tony Windsor at the time. And that was a difficult decision for him to make, but we benefited greatly from that. If we look back at the things that we got in that short period of time, we were very fortunate to get those things come to our electorate in various towns. And it is possible that Labor will form a minority government. So the way the numbers stack up at the moment, I believe we're going back to 150 electorates. We went from 150 to 151, I believe. We're going back to 150, which is interesting. But either way, you need 76 to form government, 76 seats in the lower house to form government. Labor has more than 76 at the moment, but not heaps more than 76. The National Party has 15 lower house seats, and the Liberal Party has 40, so they have 55. So they need to get more than 20 seats to form government.
And of course, they're also dealing with the fact that you have the Teal independents as well as a strong possible independents, and for Labor and the Coalition, One Nation, depending on where they are, could have some sort of sizable vote.
Yeah, so I think there's 12 or maybe more than 12 people who don't belong to the two major parties, ID, the Coalition or Labor. So it is very unlikely that Peter Dutton will be the Prime Minister, because it's very unlikely he's going to get more than 20 seats to flip to Liberal or National Party.
Do you think he's too divisive as a leader because of how controversial he has been in the past?
I've had conversations in the last week with a number of people about the kinds of things that he's saying. And they sort of go, is that for real? And I said, well, you've got to take him on his word on what he's saying. And I think he's seeing what's happened in America, frankly, and he's thinking, well, that might work. But I actually think Australians are more open-minded. And I think Australians are prepared, maybe not right now, maybe when we get close to the election, but I think they're more prepared to do their homework and look at the policies and look at the track record of Labor of this first term and make their mind up. And you mentioned Labor being unpopular and, Dutton looking like a preferred Prime Minister. Labor's numbers have improved in the last week or two, quite a bit. So we're hoping for that trend to continue. And I think people are starting to take notice of what they've seen happen in the last 3 years. I don't discount the fact that across the whole entire world, people are struggling with cost of living. A number of factors have contributed to that. You can't put it all at the door of governments. It's global factors that can influence all of that. But I think we're going to improve, and people are going to be considering us for sure.
There is also a big concern given the political instability in the US with Donald Trump imposing these tariffs on Canada and Mexico and those countries responding. One of the biggest problems and concerns within the National Party itself has been, what if Donald Trump, for whatever reason, decides to impose tariffs on Australian beef exports and Australian agricultural exports, which could have a massive detrimental effect on their livelihoods, because given the fact that we have had to move away from the Middle East because of the live export ban, which is still very controversial among many Australian farmers, and moving towards the United States, given the fact that we are having this situation that could be potentially unstable or very uncertain, what kind of impacts could tariffs actually have on Australia? Because the last thing we want to get involved is a trade war that's not of our own doing.
Well, I think the first thing that would happen is I think that we would negotiate and approach the US and talk about how we've been a strong ally of theirs. And we've got, amazing Foreign Minister in Penny Wong, amazing Agricultural Minister in Murray Watt, and Trade and Agriculture. And I think that they would be heading themselves over to the US and having a bit of a chat with the federal government in the US and asking them why they see that benefit in doing that, and encouraging them not to do that. So I think they would try and head them off at the pass and avoid that from happening.
And even though this is not necessarily a major issue federally for us in the New England, it is one that does affect us, and that is the current issues going on in Gaza. And we know that at the moment there have been a variety of, ranging from Jewish voters to Muslim voters, but also those who are more of a pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli bent, that depending on what the federal government does or doesn't do, they certainly seem to turn off or head towards whatever those actions are. While we know that there have been issues with some of the more socially conservative Islamic seats, particularly that Labor holds, that are possibly at risk. We also have had issues around Senator Fatima Payman at the moment. Given that we are also having these anti-Semitic attacks in areas like Sydney, and even Wee Waa the other week, and people are saying that Labor typically should be aligning themselves with the pro-Palestinian movement, which has scared the Jewish community. And if the Labor aligns with the Jewish community, that scares the pro-Palestinian community. This could be a major issue where Labor could be losing a lot of votes. And we saw that that's actually what happened in the US in their presidential election, over how that situation has been unfolding.
Look, I think you've made some really valid points there, and it is a vexed issue for sure. And I think Labor, probably among Labor voters and Labor supporters, there would be a range of opinions for sure, which I would expect, because we are a party that welcomes all sorts of people with all sorts of opinions and all sorts of points of view for sure. Again, I think that Labor really shines in their diplomacy, and I'm absolutely certain that they would be working on that right at this point in time. I know that the Prime Minister, Albo, has spoken about the anti-Semitic things that have happened in recent weeks, and how sad that is and how inappropriate that is, and frankly un-Australian. So I know that that people would be looking to that and hopefully feeling confident and safe in the comments that the Prime Minister has made. Again, like I said, not an easy issue, not straight, and not black and white. I mean, making it out to be black and white is dumbing it down and making it too simple. It's a very complex issue, for sure.
And before we finish up, one major issue, of course, is that many of Tamworth's Indigenous community are still hurting from the Voice referendum campaign, which, when I've been observing it, it really was not a fantastic campaign that was done by the proponents. I think in many ways it was very confusing. People weren't even sure if it would make any big difference at the moment. We know that the fallout from that has been particularly hurtful in major areas with significant Indigenous populations. but we're still seeing areas where life expectancy is still poor, unemployment, domestic violence, this even to a degree some racism still being thrown about. How can Labor actually at least alleviate some of these issues, because there are people out there who are suffering?
Yep, that's for sure. I was actually quite involved in the Yes campaign. I believed very much in it. I met a range of really interesting people across the area, and I was pretty disappointed with the result personally. The New England electorate had one of the lowest Yes votes in Australia, I think in the lowest 5 of the 150 electorates in Australia. So that I was personally disappointed. However, there are a number of programs that are happening. I was actually talking to someone who hails from Moree, and this is at a state level, but Chris Minns has been up to Moree 8 or 9 times to talk to the folk up there about the issues with crime, for example. And we all know that sometimes crime is committed by young Indigenous people, not always, certainly not always. And again, like I said before, it's a really complex issue. You know, I think yelling at them and saying terrible things about them is not at all helpful. But to me, that's an example of how Labor is prepared to get in and talk with the stakeholders, the local people, and try and come up with some solutions. And I know that I know Moree is very grateful for that. For example, Moree is not in our electorate, but that's an example of the kinds of things that Labor does. I'm actually, as I'm sure you know, Daniel, I'm a volunteer. I've been a volunteer breastfeeding counsellor for over 30 years, and I'm a trainer and assessor. So I train lovely young mums to become counsellors like me. And I'm actually having a meeting pretty soon with TAMS, the Tamworth Aboriginal Medical Service, how I can support them and their young mums. And so one of their staff members I'm going to have a meeting with her. I'm also on a committee at the hospital that supports the maternity services at Tamworth Hospital. And I go from that community's perspective and help the hospital consider different perspectives. And that's another area, midwives and nurses, where we need more. And they're doing a lot. They're doing as much as they possibly can to try and get people to work. And we're getting lots of people from overseas to come and work in this amazing country, Australia. So I do think, for me, Labor is the party for Indigenous people. It's just, I can't see an alternative, quite frankly, because I just don't think, particularly the National Party, really, I haven't heard anything from them in a very long time that supports Indigenous people. It was frustrating. The referendum was frustrating because there was misinformation, and it was dumbed down and made black and white and all of that, and it really wasn't like that. But anyway, we move on, and we will always be there for Indigenous people, absolutely.
Laura Hughes, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate your time.
Federal ALP candidate for the seat of New England, Laura Hughes there. The Australian Jewish community are living in fear following a series of anti-Semitic attacks across the country. In fact, today, a man was charged with making death threats and sending anti-Semitic language towards a New South Wales-based politician. And in Sydney's King's Cross, a man has been charged after unfurling a swastika flag. As the situation in the Middle East and in other places like America continue to spill into Australia, what can be done to combat anti-Semitism? And also, how do you solve an issue like this conflict between Palestinian militants and the State of Israel? Joining me now from Melbourne is Ohad Kozminsky, an executive member of the Jewish Council of Australia. Mr. Kozminsky, thank you very much for joining us. Even today, we've had more anti-Semitic attacks happening in Australia with the unfurl of a swastika in King's Cross. I mean, the situation that's been happening over the past year or so, it really must feel very unnerving for so many members of the Jewish community across Australia. How are you feeling?
I think, look, I just agree with you first, Daniel, that it is a really unnerving situation. It's been unnerving for some time. It's been unnerving in my mind for a lot of reasons. I mean, firstly, there has been this spate of anti-Semitic, of graffiti, of firebombing, both in Victoria and New South Wales, of arson, And that is really unsettling to a community that knows intergenerational trauma and that has historical memory, that has so many Holocaust survivors who have settled here. That said, it's been unsettling even before these anti-Semitic acts. It's been unsettling as a Jewish person to feel there is a kind of an anti-Semitism bound up with assuming that Jewish people support Israel, support whatever Israel does, support Israel's ideology, and that's actually a deeply damaging assumption. And for that reason, even before these attacks, which are horrifying, which are terrifying, which are deeply unsettling, it's been a really difficult time. It's been a difficult time, I can say, for all Jewish people. But the Jewish Council of Australia doesn't speak for all Jewish people. For me personally, it's been a difficult time because of that implication of Jewish people, Jewish identity with the actions of a nation state and with the claim of that nation state to act on behalf of all Jewish people. And the claim of some Jewish organizations to do the same. Yeah.
Looking at the situation at the moment, are you concerned that even though we now have this ceasefire that's currently still in force between the state of Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the actions that could be either from Hamas or from Israel or even the US government or other parties, if they announce or act or do something differently, like we've had this very unusual proposal from Donald Trump about moving 1.7 million Gazans out of Gaza, at least temporarily, and reconstruct it. Are you concerned that that kind of language and ideas and rhetoric could actually fuel more anti-Semitism towards the Jewish community?
In short, yes. I mean, it's very clear that Israel's campaign, which has been called genocidal by a range of human rights organizations, um, and we do know there is the standing case at the International Court of Justice, that what Israel has been doing, again, in the name of Jewish people, or saying that it's doing it in the name of Jewish people, is definitely something that creates an opening for anti-Semitic sentiment. I would say, in passing, though, that I have attended pro-Palestine, Palestine solidarity rallies, and I don't experience that sentiment in that context. But I definitely think that when Israel does what it does and does what it does proudly, those anti-Semites who are looking for an opening will take it. And when Donald Trump does call for let's call it what it is, the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, that can only exacerbate that opening that anti-Semites would love to jump into, exploit, and deepen.
The reason, of course, I'm bringing part of this issue up is occasionally when I see, particularly on Twitter, there are many accounts that are definitely pro-Palestinian that argue that instead of removing or shifting anyone from Gaza or the West Bank, we should move more than the 6 million Jews living in Israel. We should have no state of Israel. The entire area should just be called Palestine. And I look at that and I see a lot of people agreeing. And in many ways, this whole situation is like these two sides are, in some cases, very disturbingly like each other, especially the more extremist fringe, which essentially wants to annihilate one of each other. And we know that how damaging and how many people can die from rhetoric and decisions like that from both sides. And this is not a whataboutism kind of aspect I'm looking at. This is something that I'm struggling to understand in many ways to understand. If people are arguing for one case that is strikingly similar to another case on the other side, this situation shows that it's so much more complex that no easy solution is actually identifiable unless we actually have proper discussions.
Look, the starting point at the Jewish Council of Australia is that we believe in upholding human rights, and human rights should be upheld without exception. They are, to be human rights, they have to be universal and inalienable. So any call for the mass slaughter of individuals, any call for the contravention of human rights is clearly not a path forward. Where I become a bit wary is that when we compare a group like Hamas or Islamic Jihad or something to the Israeli government and to the right-wing Israeli government, we have on the one hand a small organized force standing against one of the most powerful militaries in the world. And that asymmetry cannot be overlooked when we're trying to evaluate the situation. That's, in a lot of ways, the starting point of trying to work out the way through it. That if there is to be a change, the party that has the military, economic, and political power in the situation is the party that needs to be taking the first step and creating the openings. And that has been the case for some time now. But again, we don't, and I don't condone any calls that entail the contravention of the human rights of other people. And the point of those human rights, again, is that they are inalienable and universal, which means a person cannot be stripped of them, and they apply to all people. And that has to be our starting point. And international law has to be our starting point, because without that, it's who has the bigger guns, which is currently the game that Israel has been playing. And we know where that leads. We can see where that leads, and it's terrifying.
At the moment, are you at least happy with how in Australia about the law enforcement and the political responses are to many of these anti-Semitic attacks that have taken place across Australia? I know we recently have had in the Australian Parliament tougher, more stringent laws targeting hate speech. And if you look at what's going on Twitter, I mean, it's like a car crash in slow motion. And we've seen some incredibly disturbing counts about targeting Israelis, Israeli Australians, Jewish people, and all that. How have you found that the response at the moment?
So I think what we know is that, firstly, Australia has a racism problem. It's had a racism problem for as long as it's existed in one form or another. There has been racism against Jewish people. Jewish people were the paradigm of refugees after World War II that we've seen more recently. The kind of language that was used is probably not unfamiliar to the language we hear now sometimes. We have recently heard around refugees. A lot of anti-Semitic tropes were brought in. Jews are ugly, strange. They're taking your jobs, your low-paying jobs. They control the media. They control the government. Jewish people are sly and dodgy, all these sorts of things that we've seen. So we know that that's the case. We also know that there has also been a rise in Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian sentiment, and we know that these things happen together. We know that racism, although each form of racism is different and has different catalysts, we know that they emerge in tandem, and we're seeing that in this case. And so, in terms of how the best way to respond to racism, to anti-Semitism and to all other forms of racism, we really need to think carefully about it. We know there's a lot of evidence that mandatory sentencing does not create deterrence. It sounds good. It sounds impressive. Politicians, at least politicians, think so. They think it makes it look like they are taking action. But we know that that's not how racism gets fought. We know that racism is a really complex social problem, and laws are not enough, and they can be counterproductive. So, and we do have institutions like the Australian Human Rights Commission that has a national anti-racism framework that really lays out a whole of society systemic approach to dealing with racism. And mandatory sentencing is not one of those prongs. There's a lot of really interesting things that need to be done around media, arts, education, around policing and the law, things that need to happen in the health sector, in the workplace, data collection. There's a lot of things that need to be done that would be much more effective. I would say again that in the context of the racism we're seeing now, the Australian government's support for what Israel is doing is not helping the situation. Israel is clearly contravening international law, and the Australian government, as it has done, say, for example, in the case of Russia or Myanmar, it should be taking action.
How can in Israel itself, the Israeli opposition, that is like the Democrats, the more pro-peace, or those on the left or the center, how can they be able to come in and try and at least grapple some of the positions and support away from the Netanyahu government, and at least provide maybe some kind of an attempt where they could possibly be able to not only maybe have a more longer lasting peace, but also can try and reduce some of this anti-Semitic attacks that are happening across the world?
It's a big question. It's a big question. I mean, I don't feel confident articulating a complete strategy for what exists of the Israeli left at the moment. I will say that the Israeli left, such as it is in the minority, and in some cases is supportive of the status quo, and that I find quite worrying. There are some holdouts, and those holdouts offer some hope. There are organisations who are really calling for an end to, again, for instance, the Israeli human rights organisation B'Tselem is very clear about Israel's occupation, is clear that even before October 7 that Israel was exercising an apartheid regime, and it provides ample evidence for that finding. If there is to be an Israeli left that comes into ascendancy, it needs to shift the narrative in a profound way, and in a way that actually changes the narrative of Jewish identity in and through Israel. That is a huge task. It's a narrative that requires, again, for the recognition of the human rights of the people of Palestine as equal to the human rights of the Jewish people of Israel, and of all the people in Israel, including the Palestinian and Israeli citizens. So it's a huge task. I mean, I at the moment, the task in Melbourne that I can speak to, in Australia, I'm in Melbourne, but the task in Australia is something that I can talk more meaningfully about in terms of what needs to be done. From the perspective of the Jewish Council, we are putting forward, and this is really about, as much as it's about, the task in Melbourne is to dampen and close down opportunities for racism to arise, whether that be anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian racism or any other kind of racism. And the way that we get there, again, is by, at least from the perspective of the Jewish Council, is to make it clear that there are many Jewish people. We don't speak for all Jewish people. We don't speak for a majority. We speak for many Jewish people who are convinced of the universality and the inalienability of human rights, and the consequence of that meaning that you can't have a situation where there are millions of people living as non-citizens, as occupied peoples. That's just got to be the no-brainer, and there are so many Jewish people who think that, and the more that we can put that out, the more we can create an atmosphere where any attempts by politicians to speak for all Jews, on behalf of all Jews, as supporters of what Israel is doing and as effective supporters of occupation and apartheid, any politician who does that will have to think twice, to the extent that there are lots of Jewish people who really disagree with that view, and who don't identify themselves with Israel's actions. That's our core work. And our core work is also to stand in solidarity with people who, with, again, Palestinians, with Muslim people, and with Jewish people who are standing up and saying that, and to do our best to speak in unison with them in defense of human rights. But in terms of what happens in terms of Israeli politics, I don't feel confident or competent to speak to what the path forward is. Yeah.
I know that the JCA has also accused the opposition leader here in Australia, Peter Dutton, of using the Jewish community as a political football. Can you explain what that concern is?
Well, that concern is very close to what I just explained, which is the notion that Peter Dutton can stand up and speak for, on behalf of all Jews in the name of the concerns and the needs and the interests of all Jews. And he doesn't do that because he's found a heart. Because recall, this is the man who scared us in Melbourne about these African gangs, who spearheaded an anti-refugee policy at times, who has clearly not shown concern for racialized people, who walked out of Kevin Rudd's apology. So he has a track record. So when he is using Jewish people as his sign of his, support of his anti-racist position, we have to ask ourselves what's in it for him, because his track record is not supporting racialized or marginalized peoples. His track record is exploiting those peoples for political gain. And so what we see here is that Dutton thinks he can get one over Albanese by being harder on this, by being more intense on this. And in that way, his actions don't appear to us to be concerned for the well-being of Jewish people. Because if it was, maybe he would think to dampen this to dampen his rhetoric about what's going on. But his concern is actually to ramp it up, which means he doesn't care. It appears to us that he's not concerned with minimizing this spate of violence. And again, as someone who has been in politics for a long time, he should also know that mandatory sentencing doesn't work, and that it is a political theatre that is being used to pursue a political agenda, to wedge the Labor Party in the upcoming election.
And we're heading towards the end of this interview, but Mr. Kozminsky, one thing I was interested in also hearing about your opinions is there are some aspects when it comes to those who are like organizations as yourself, or the pro-peace camp, standing up for Palestinian rights, the fact you standing up for what has been happening in Gaza. There is still, it's a bit difficult to ignore the fact that there will be many people and many countries that, regardless of any actions by the State of Israel, regarding if they recognize the State of Palestine tomorrow, regardless if they agree to withdraw from the West Bank, they will nevertheless call for the destruction of the Jewish state or the Jewish people, regardless of any overtures that may be made from within the government of Israel to the people of the Jewish community of Australia. Do you understand what I'm meaning when I say that there is still that going to be those type of people and those type of organizations and countries who, regardless of whatever could happen, they still don't want to have a Jewish state in the Middle East?
So I think we need to, there's a lot in this. Thank you for this question. There's a lot in it. The first thing I would say is that one thing that's unacceptable, one thing that we will always be fighting against, is any campaign that calls for the killing or the oppression of any group of people on the basis of them being that group of people. Anyone who stands for the mass killing of people or for the oppression of people, again, they're not standing for human rights. So our task is to fight racism where it emerges. Now, that's a separate question, and to fight it, I should say, through that complex multi-pronged approach, not through just a law and order approach. Of course, if people break the law, we need to deal with that. Firebombing can't be left unpoliced, but the notion that law and order is the only way, we know that that's not the case. So that's the first point. The second point is the question of the political organization of the state apparatus that currently exists in that part of the world is a legitimate source of debate. Whether it should be one state, whether it should be two states, how it should function, those are fair, legitimate things to debate in the political arena, assuming one is not calling for the mass slaughter or expulsion of one group or another group, right? Clearly, whatever happens in the future, the positive outcome is one in which people can live in a way that is just,
Yes,
right? In a way
because
that is just and experienced as just by all of the people involved. So there may be some people who are calling um, for the expulsion of all the Jewish people who live in that part of the world, in that territory, in Palestine, in Israel, or however we frame it. What I would say is that, in my experience at least, that appears to be a minority. And I think in a lot of ways it's pushing us away from what we need to come to terms with, which is this profound asymmetry of military, economic, and political power that is stopping any just resolution, just outcome from playing out. So unless we deal with the actual concrete reality on the ground, which is this asymmetry and which is this history of dispossession and ethnic cleansing, unless we deal with that and its consequences, this continues. And when I say we, I shouldn't say we because it's not me, right? But in this case, it's actually very much Israel and its allies who have the overwhelming, like the almost unimaginably overwhelming power to facilitate that kind of a change. And that's really where I come back to. Again, but anyone who's calling for genocide, oppression, expulsion, or anything like that, clearly they're not people that we are interested in platforming or supporting.
And finally, Mr. Kozminsky, what would you want the authorities here in Australia to really do to help combat anti-Semitism? As we said, we've even had more attacks today, and up here, even in the town of Weewar, we had a 15-year-old who was caught burning swastikas into sports courts and anti-Semitic language. And some people, of course, you look at Twitter, the hellhole that's become. And then you look at the rhetoric from various political leaders and organizations going on, ranging from the government of Iran to the government of Israel, Donald Trump, even here in Australia. What would you like to see?
So again, I think the first thing that needs to happen is that Australia, I apologize, that the Australian government needs to take concrete action. Concrete action to show that it does not accept the breaches of human rights that Israel continues to commit. I think insofar as Israel is a country that calls itself a Jewish state, that claims to speak and act for all Jews, insofar as it does that, its actions have an impact on Jewish people. And insofar as Australia supports that, it has an impact on Jewish people and on, again, giving opportunities for anti-Semites to exploit. Now, in addition to that, we need to start to think, as I said before, about racism in a systemic way. We need to think about how our education system, how our media works, how our workplaces function, how organizations work. We need to be getting lost in the weeds as per the National Anti-Racism Framework outlines. We need to be doing a complex all-intervention. Again, if people break the law, if people do these horrible, terrifying things of firebombing synagogues and child centers and all the graffiti, all of this, what happened in Willow as well, like this is really scary stuff. And clearly when laws are broken, there's a role for policing. But policing doesn't solve the problem of sentiment, right? Policing doesn't solve the problem of people feeling a certain way and acting in response to those feelings. We deal with that as a society and in a really nuanced, complex, and multi-institutional way. We don't get anywhere just by mandatory sentences or by restricting legitimate public protest in solidarity with Palestine. And then I would add that there has been no evidence that any of these actions have been connected to the Palestine solidarity movement, and that many people who have sought to beat this drum have made that claim without evidence and without justification, which I would suggest also exacerbates anti-Semitism. by creating this tense oppositional atmosphere that that pits Jewish people unjustly and inaccurately pits all Jewish people against the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which clearly it's not the case that's not the case. Yeah.
Ohad Kozminsky, thank you very much for joining us on Firstline.
Thank you so much for your time.
Ohad Kozminsky, Executive Member of the Jewish Council of Australia from Melbourne there. And that is Firstline for now. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. Have a great weekend, and I hope to see you soon. Good night.